Autumn 1936 Barcelona. A dark room above La Rambla, windows shuttered, light cut to a red wound, and a tray of fixer rocking like a quiet tide. On the wire a contact strip still wet, 3 uniforms crisp, and certain 3 faces, scrubbed to milk-white blanks, as if dipped and lifted and scarred by a careful hand. The emulsion lifted in crescents where fingertips pressed too long. The print hangs by a rusted clip and drips onto a floor stained like an old bruise. The city hums through the wood and refuses to say a name. But the faces do not come back. A clerk sits at a high desk and works by breath and candle stub, and the rubber stamp whispers withdrawn in violet ink. The ledger page reads Comite de Militias, a roster, for escorts a margin note. 3, then a slash that breaks mid-stroke, where the page was torn clean along the spine. Another hand tried to repair the rip with a strip of paste that never held. The scrap left behind wears a thumbprint that looks like soot. The clerk signs nothing and puts the stamp away before anyone knocks. Yet the ink refuses to dry. There is a hill of bread lines and a low siren that does not stop. Trucks glide down parallel without headlamps, and men signal with gloved hands and whispered curses because blackout is a habit now. Barricades knit from cobbles and timber and sacks of grain. Convents emptied and turned into dip-pots, and the stone still smelling of incense and oil. Orphanages widened by beds pushed tight wall to wall, and a lullaby whistled through teeth that taste of smoke. The city walks on nerves and keeps its pockets inside out, and the record stumbles when it tries to keep pace. 3 militiawomen appear in one frame only. One wears a jacket marked with chalk stars at the cuffs, the chalk not brushed away before the shutter fell. One has bootlaces double-tied, the free ends cut short. One holds a cigarette without touching it to her mouth, because the photographer raised a hand and asked for stillness. A coin with a cord cuts a circle in the cloth at a throat. They are armed, and they look just beyond the camera at something we cannot see. The uniforms keep their lines even now. The names do not. What is known lives where the light is thin. A contact sheet from a Catalan press suitcase, found decades later with 3 frames blacked out by hand, and 1 untouched that someone missed. A roster that lists 3 female volunteers attached to a Barcelona escort detail in late October. A tram conductor who wrote in a small notebook that 3 women in work boots rode a requisition truck toward the port at dusk and tucked their red kerchiefs into their collars because the wind would tear the fabric if they let it flail. A hospital ledger that lists 3 female admissions unknown, no ages, no discharges, and then a single word crossed out with a blunt nail. The paper speaks and then bites its own tongue. What is missing raises more noise than what is present. A page lifted from the malicious file and never put back. A corner of the St. Paul Ward book blackened along a curve like a match swept fast and then pinched out. An envelope in the Arxiu municipal marked Fins al Canvi Dr. Jim with a pencil that dug too hard and tore the surface, and when the regime changed no one opened it because the drawer had already been locked for another purpose. The photographer's name erased from a credit line and replaced with a dash. The gap grows teeth. The first incident held no drama until someone looked twice. A convoy rings the Plaza de Catalunya in the gray of morning and idles under a lid of low cloud. A lieutenant with a blunt pencil counts heads and crates and signs a name that looks like chalk rubbed with a thumb. The 3 women are waved up to escort a crate marked glass that ought to weigh much more than it does. The truck lurches south and turns toward the port, and the driver keeps the lamps dead because the rules keep men alive until they do not. The count will not be the same when they stop. Between Drassanes and the harbor the chain sings against the bed, and a man jumps down to tighten it, and the tailgate lifts and shuts, and it is the smallest sound on earth. When you are listening for other things, the convoy breathes and holds its breath and moves as one animal, case to case, axle to axle. A phone log in the port office records 3 female voices on a line that was not supposed to carry voices that night, then a wire hiss and a hard stop. A clerk underlines the time and tears the page wrong at the perforation. The hour refuses to be whole. A night nurse at St. Paul writes 3 in the margin and smears the ink with her sleeve because she never waits for ink to dry. She draws 3 slashes instead of names, and someone later thinks they are tally marks and someone else thinks they are a charm against forgetting, and both are wrong. She writes the word transferred and leaves the destination blank, because the ward sister tells her to move faster and not ask. When asked again years later, the nurse will say only that boots on tile make a sound that never leaves a room. The air keeps it. A residue remains even when hands have done their best. A leather strap cut, and then retied with a knotted fold neater than battle would allow. Suit pricked across a contact sheet where ash fell long after the shot was taken. A faint grease of salt on the back of a ration card stamped with a number that repeats in a different ink 3 times. The sea sends one scarf up on a wave, then takes it back, and the stone quayside seals its mouth against words like pushed and pulled and taken. Silence is not peace, and it never was. You were not meant to see this. That is what the documents say when you stand over them too long and do not speak. They fog under breath as if they were glass and still living. Warnings linger in the staples, and the stitches do not line up, and the drawers that hold folders close on their own. You feel watched by the blankness, where eyes should be in a single print hung to dry and never filed. There is a price for opening a drawer that was meant to stay shut. The papers will tell you an escort was reassigned, and the photographs will tell you they were present, and the ledgers will tell you they crossed a threshold and did not cross back. The respectable surface holds while you are in the reading room, and then it sags by a finger's width as soon as you turn away. One historian says procedure. One veteran says fog. One grandmother says they took the long road to Aragon, and the wind ate their letters, and she will not say more. The truth watches and waits for the light to fail. But why did this happen, and why was it erased from history? If this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell. Tell us what city and state you are listening from. The envelope is brittle as winter skin. Arcs you municipal contemporáneo de Barcelona. A hand once wrote Roasters Obligats in pencil that bit too hard and scored the paper beneath. Inside 3 ration cards with the same number stamped in different inks. Red, violet, black. The fibers flare where a nail caught and lifted a corner, as if someone tested whether the past could peel. The inventory slip tucked behind them insists nothing removed, but the count will not sit still. A contact sheet attributed to a Catalan press photographer. The strip is unbroken, yet 3 frames are drowned under a tar of graphite and fixative. Not a censor bar. A burial. In the margins, a soft thumbprint that never belonged to the photographer. The pressure marks left by a metal clip outline a rectangle where another fragment should hang. The chain is intact. The link is missing. But the paper pretends not to notice. There are ways to injure an image without leaving a wound anyone will admit. A bath made too strong. A patient hand with cotton. A blade drawn not to slice but to lift. The face goes first. The uniform remains as proof the camera did not lie. The lie is in what is gone. The gelatin buckles into a crescent where a fingertip lingered. The black swallows the eyes, and the eyes keep looking from underneath. But no signature claims the act. Barcelona after the uprising holds its breath and speaks through clenched teeth. CNT patrols at the corners and Puyom banners in the wind. Convents emptied and turned to storerooms. Orphanages swollen until cribs press like a second wall. Women stand armed on barricades in the first heat of the war, and the papers smile at the novelty and the bravery. Then the new army wants uniforms that match and ranks that obey. The order comes in the language of tidiness and efficiency. Women out of the lines and into auxiliary work. Hospitals' kitchen signals. The decree does not say why. It never says who. But the order cannot erase its shadow. On paper the city remains respectable. La Vanguardia prints reorganizations and says the streets are calm. Solidaridad Obrera runs tall columns of names and units and speaks of discipline as if it were a warm blanket. La Batalla argues for coordination and then for silence. The municipal circular files the matter under reassignment and closes the drawer. A radio voice reads the day's notices and clears its throat when it comes to the part about women. The respectable surface holds steady, but the next page sticks as if damp. Witnesses come and go like tram bells fading into fog. A conductor in a cap too big for his head writes that 3 women rode a requisitioned lorry toward the port at dusk. He notes work boots. He notes kerchiefs tucked in tight so the wind cannot tell. A seamstress in Pobl-sec remembers fitting a jacket and marking the cuffs with chalk, because the arms were shorter than the pattern allowed. She never brushed the chalk away. It shows in the one surviving print. A nurse says blue-black hair and boots that never came off, because the floor was cold and time was not hers to give. The witnesses do not know each other. Their words rhyme where they should not. But no one writes the names. Archivists take notes with a reverence that looks like fear. St. Paul Hospital Ledger. 3 female admissions in a single column after midnight. Cause left blank. Destination left blank. The line for discharge left untouched like a mouth kept closed. The ink pools where a hand paused too long. A municipal memo whispers about transfers to rear service and uses language tight as a noose. The roster from the Comite de Militias is numbered twice, and the second numbering climbs over the first like ivy. The handwriting changes mid-line without apology, but the heading claims continuity. Respectable surface first. That is the rule in files that survived. The decree prints clean. The signatures are aligned. The stamps are centered and proud. A typed list reads reassigned escort details redistributed to port security, then to hospitals, then to food supply. There is a logic you can trace with a finger like a route on a map. Then the route stops at the water. Then the logic loops back into itself and calls the loop a system. But the system will not explain the blanks. The materials tell another story when the gloves are off and the room is still. The ledger has a page torn out along the spine and pasted back with a strip that misaligns the lines by the width of a fingernail. The paste has browned to sugar and given up. Rust shadows sit where a staple once pinched and held a note that is gone. Ash freckles the inside flap of an envelope that should never have seen fire. The smell of old fixative lives in the cardstock, as if someone tried to wash time and left a stain. But the stain keeps spreading. Portside context matters because it is where the numbers begin to lie. Blackout turns the harbor into a mouth without teeth. Crates marked glass or medicine or spare parts move under tarps and curses. Manifests are copied twice to make up for the dark, and the sea air chews the ink by morning. Convoys leave in order and return in a different order, and no one pretends to be surprised. A crate weighs wrong by an amount no one can agree on. A rifle count is short by 3, and the clerk writes reissued and hopes the word will be enough. But the tally knocks like a trapped thing. The city keeps the respectable front. Posters layer over posters until a rain pulls them down in strips like shed skin. Speeches promise unity while the floorboards of the union halls weep at the knots. The newspapers run photographs of women at typewriters and say the rear guard is glorious work. The photographs stare back with eyes that remember other things. A caption says efficiency. A mouth set hard says otherwise. But captions do not blink. You can map the harm without naming it, and that is the only map that holds. A face erased from a print draws the attention to what remains. A uniform becomes a mask. A ledger without discharges becomes a list of rooms that never opened again. A ration card with a number repeated in 3 hands makes a single stomach into 3. The object wears the crime without describing it. The city learns to look at edges instead of centers. But the edges cut. People fold memory to fit it into drawers. A veteran insists it was reassignment and nothing else. He swears the order. He swears the dates. He does not swear the faces. A party man says desertion and his mouth makes a small pleased shape at the word. An old woman says the girls took the Aragon Road and never wrote, because the wind stole the letters. And she refuses to say more, because there is a child in the room. They all tell the truth they can carry. But a heavier truth waits in the hall. The respectable surface is set out like a table before the feast. The plates are matched. The napkins are folded. The knives point inward. On the wall a calendar shows late October, and a saint no one has prayed to in years. Everything looks correct. Everything smells of soap. Then there is a shadow that belongs to nobody, and it pools under the door from the port. The room goes quiet, but the respectable surface does not move to clear it. What was found is odd because it should be ordinary. ration cards orphaned from their owners. A contact sheet altered so deliberately it reads like a threat. A hospital ledger that breathes heavier at 3 narrow lines and then goes still. Newspapers that speak in a unison too practiced to be trusted. Files that shiver when opened as if they remember hands that were not careful. The city offers its records like alibis. But the alibis sweat. Just before daylight the square holds its breath and pretends to be stone while trucks idle in a ring that looks like a ritual, the exhaust smoke low and blue and unwilling to rise. A lieutenant with a blunt pencil touches each head and each crate as if counting were a blessing. He waves 3 women up to the rear bed to escort a box marked glass that sits too light on the planks. One jacket bears chalk stars at the cuffs that were never brushed off. A coin on a cord glints once and disappears against a throat. The pencil digs into a roster that has already been written over once, and the hand that signs is practiced in making names look like fog. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The convoy rolls south in blackout down parallel, the lamps dead by order, and the drivers using hands like lanterns to speak in the dark. Curtains flicker then go still as the trucks pass. The women sit at the tail on a plank seat, their boots, braced their rifles between knees, the wood knocking in a slow heart under the wheels. The man in the second cab says later he saw a strip of fabric hang from the top like a tongue, and then draw back as if shy. A boy with a paper cap stares and counts trucks with his fingers and swears there were 5 at the top of the hill and 4 at the bottom. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. At Drassanes a chain sings against the bed, and a man jumps down to check links by touch and habit. The tailgate lifts and shuts with a sound that is swallowed by the harbor's low throat. Someone gestures for a pause, someone else gestures for hurry, and the convoy chooses both and lunges forward, as if yanked on a string. A woman at the back stands to pull the canvas tighter, and her outline cuts a shape into the dawn that the camera would have kept if anyone had raised a lens. A note in a garage book will later mention a stop there, then a line strikes through it and leaves a bruise the paper cannot hide. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The port is an animal that does not sleep. Warehouse doors breathe in and out at the edges, and men with clipboards move as if the floor were tilting under them. The crate arrives and someone writes, received with a hand too quick and neat. The foreman draws a line through his own name for no reason he will own. The driver tells a bored clerk that the women stepped down to piss at the corner by the bollards and did not climb back, and the clerk nods without lifting his eyes and writes back in a ledger not present. A dockhand swears he saw 2 step off and a 3rd stoop to tie a boot, and then the view went black as if the street learned a new trick. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Inside the port office a phone log carries lines across the page like wounds that refuse to close. The operator writes 3 female voices and then the word cut. Under the time he draws a fierce underline that tears the paper, and someone later pastes it with a strip that does not meet the edges. In a margin a hurried note appears in a hand not seen elsewhere, the words stop at no-nos Dijon, and the ink pools as if the pen were held midair. A night clerk who read that page as a young man swears today there was a second half to the sentence, and that it named a door. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Search begins as if someone had flipped a hidden switch. Boots scrape along fish scales on tile, and dogs are walked on short wire and told to hush. Men step through the stink of brine and diesel and speak too softly to be heard by anyone but themselves. Under the lamp that does not light a scarf rises from the water heavy as a soaked book, and lies flat then slides back between stones as if pulled. A coin with a hole worn for a cord turns up under a bollard, its edge bent to a bite that does not fit any jaw. A guard writes it into his night inventory, then draws a small X and pockets the line like a secret. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. By late hour 3 entries slide into the hospital ledger at St. Paul, as if they walked in without bodies. Female unknown, the words stutter across a row, and the column for cause is left blank like a prayer nobody knows anymore. A nurse who works fast writes 3 slashes instead of names and presses her sleeve to the wet ink. and leaves a gray smear shaped like a bird's wing. She adds the word transferred and leaves the destination empty, because someone at her shoulder coughs. Years later, when asked, she says only that boots on tile make a sound that becomes a corner you cannot turn. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Back on the docks at Guardia di Assalto, Lieutenant files a memo that reads like a warning, but none can say to whom. He writes escort detail interrupted, and under that writes resumed, and under that writes unaccounted, and the stamp at the bottom bites the paper without leaving ink, as if the pad were dry on purpose. When the lieutenant loses his post, the memo loses its place and reappears years later within a folder that should have belonged to a different case. The new heading says negligence, and the old heading is cut away in a curve that matches no known blade. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. In the garage, the driver sits with a tin mug and a hand that shakes like a loose hinge. He writes on the back of a fuel chit Folta Tres, then presses the paper to the wall with his palm, as if to steady it. A mechanic hears him say they hopped off and hears him say they were taken and hears him say they were told to report to aduanas, and nothing in his mouth matches the previous hour. Another driver says there was a second crate that looked like the first, and that the escorts were sent to follow it, and found only empty floor. That man will later swear he never spoke to anyone. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The photographer who owned the suitcase of negatives prints a strip that morning and hangs it by a rusted clip, and looks once and leaves the room before the image is dry. When he returns, the faces are white ovals and the uniforms are clean lines, and the water in the tray shows a swirl like a fingerprint blown large. He signs nothing and refuses a credit for the page and dies with his cameras wrapped in newspaper that smells of sea. The strip carries pressure marks for frames no longer present and a thumbprint in a place no thumb should have reached. A friend claims the man said better this than a knock at the door. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. By noon, the respectable surface has done its work. A typed notice speaks of reassignment to auxiliary service and includes a list of numbers that match and do not. A second typing appears on the same sheet where the ribbon struck dry before, and the word withdrawn leans in violet, as if embarrassed to be there. The roster page bears a tear mended with paste that does not hold in the line with the 3 names, or 3 numbers that want to be names, runs across the seam and loses a syllable on the way. None of this stops the seal from pressing down, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. By dusk, the city talks like an old woman in a doorway. Dockers say there were 3 knocks under the planks of a certain pier, and that the wood answered back. Women in the soup line say a gray truck without markings idled by the customs gate and collected what the official trucks left behind. A man with a cap too shiny for the neighborhood says the Mujeres Libres moved the 3 by night across a seam in the city that only certain hands can feel. Someone else says a boat left for nothing and returned with nothing, and that is how you learn the new rules. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A sailor claims he saw them board a lighter and step up onto a freighter's shadow headed for Marsella, and that one turned and raised a hand, and he raised his back, and that is all. A porter says he heard something like a scream and something like a hatch and finds that his throat closes. When he tries to remember which came first, an old man says there was no sound at all, which is how you know you are being watched by a mouth you cannot see. The harbor never decides whether to tell what it knows, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. The shape of the day hardens into evidence that refuses to sit. The port manifest shows a crate received with a weight that laughs at its own numbers. The guard book shows a complete round without names and a note about a scarf without owner. The hospital ledger records 3 who came and a transfer to no place. The comite folder holds a rerouted page that flinches when touched. The space where faces should be remains the brightest part of the print. The evening draws down and the story puts on the uniform of order and leaves its boots at the door. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The first who pried was a city doctor, with hands that measured without speaking. He wrote his notes in a clinic basement with the windows painted black, and he folded the paper twice and sealed it with glue that went brittle by spring. His words did not name anyone. They named patterns. Impact without a weapon listed. Bruising that clustered instead of spreading. Intake that did not match the guard story at the door. He dated the page and added a line that read delivered and drew a small box around that single word. Years later the box remained, and the rest had blood at the edges. The doctor was transferred to a quieter ward, and he stopped saying midnight out loud. A Guardia di Assalto lieutenant filed a memo that sounded like a plea. He wrote escort detail interrupted, then a second line that read resumed, then a third that read unaccounted, and a stamp came down dry, and left only the bite. He lost his post within the month, and the memo lost its folder, and found a new one that belonged to inventory control. The paper learned to keep bad company and stayed there. A party commissario spoke to a small room, and used the word desertion until it lost its shape. No charges were brought, and the door never opened wider than his shoulders. In the other paperwork, the page for 3 was removed with care, and a strip of paste tried to pretend it had never left. In 1939, a new judge began collecting the lives of a city and squeezing them into the Causa General. His office took Republican files by the crate and tallied every whisper it could turn into ink. The 3 did not pass the doorway in either direction. Their absence became part of the order. In the late 70s, a historian at the Autonomous University walked the stacks and asked for the escort rosters. A clerk produced a folder with a neat title, and inside a single sheet that said pendiente and nothing else. The historian wrote a grant in pencil on the back of a used envelope and was told to wait. He waited through one winter, and the folder was not there in spring. In the 90s, a reporter followed a rumor down the stairs of a newspaper office to a drawer with a black padlock. He was told the key was mislaid, and later that the drawer belonged to another department, and later that the cabinet had been moved. He wrote a short column about 3 women and 1 crate and received a phone call that said, "You are granting them too much weight." In 2009, an archivist with a habit of opening the wrong boxes pried up a false bottom and found a contact sheet with 3 frames buried in tar and 1 frame left alive by oversight or mercy. She logged the find in blue ink that never fades and placed it under glass. The case shivered and quieted. What the papers chose to print sat clean on the morning benches. Negligence was the word that made it past the censors and into the small reports. Reassignment was the second word, and it arrived like a bandage. The streets echoed the print for a week. The whisper was older. The whisper said darker. The whisper said the crates were not glass, and the convoy did not go where the map claimed. The whisper named a door at a Duenas that did not stay on its hinges, and the shadow beyond that did not belong to the sea. There are a few things a hand can hold without dropping. A roster lists 3 female volunteers attached to a Barcelona escort detail in the last week of October. The numbers sit in a column that climbs steady. The second numbering climbs over the first like ivy and ends 1 line short. A port manifest acknowledges 1 crate delivered with a weight that speaks a lighter truth than the stenciled word would have you believe. A hospital ledger records 3 unknowns admitted after midnight, with the line for discharge left clean as a shroud. A phone log speaks of 3 female voices, then a cut that tore the paper itself. These are not rumors. They are injuries that can be touched. Yet each fact carries a bruise that does not match the hand that left it. The roster is torn along the spine and mended with paste that misaligns the names by the width of a fingernail. The port manifest shows the foreman writing his own name, then drawing a line through it for reasons that belong to him and him alone. The hospital ledger accepts 3, and then adds transferred and leaves the destination blank, as if the city had grown a place no one could point to. The phone log underlines the time with a violence that suggests someone wanted the number to fight back. None of this explains a face cut away from a print. Speculation began to hold court, where silence would not perform. One version says a phalangist cell shadowed the convoy through the blackout, and took the escorts at the turn of a corner, and left nothing a clerk would have to write. If that is true, the hospital entries require a reason. Another version says an internal purge was already underway and visible women made the wrong kind of symbol, and someone ordered an example arranged without paperwork. If that is true, the rifles should not have been reissued by morning. A kinder version imagines the three staging their own vanishing and crossing the city with help from Mujir's libers toward work and safety that did not require permission. If that is true, the port office should not hold a phone line that heard three voices and then heard a cut, as if a blade had learned to breathe. There are less kind versions that travel only by night. Smugglers running medicine into the wrong hands. A foreign agent trading faces for a second identity. A dockside debt settled in a ledger that used no words. Each story wears a badge of plausibility until it must lift its sleeve and show the wrist. Then the marks do not match. A story that relies on a boat cannot explain the hospital column. A story that relies on a clinic cannot explain a manifest line that was written too early to know. Each theory buckles when it leans on another. Folklore did what it always does and filled the vacuum with its own air. People said the faces were chemically erased from every print they touched, and that the emulsion kept the memory like a second skin under the wound. People said their names were spoken once each year at a corner of the port, and that the sea answered back one time only, and no one returned after that. Dock workers knocked on planks and listened for 3 knocks returned, and sometimes the wood obliged, and sometimes it did not, and the difference changed the way a man slept. A coin with a bite mark in its edge was carried by families who would not say why, and they rubbed it until the metal thinned. A door in Aduanas was said to open onto water with no step in between. No one tried it twice. Contradictions stacked themselves like crates labeled fragile and handled roughly. The convoy log says the trucks cleared the square just after dawn, and the tram conductor writes that he saw the lorry with the 3 at dusk, and the city cannot hold both without tearing. The lieutenant writes that the chain was checked at a given corner, while the garage blotter marks a stop 2 streets beyond. The hospital ledger shows ink that belongs to night, yet the blot on the sleeve that pressed it shows daylight in its color. The port manifest says received with a flourish, and yet the foreman draws through his own name, as if he had been warned not to appear in the picture at all. Investigators met in the documents without ever seeing each other in life. The doctor's note mentions bruising that clustered, the lieutenant's memo mentions unaccounted, and a stamp with no ink. The commissario's statement uses desertion as a broom. The judge's registry uses omission as a verdict. The historian writes pendient on a slip, because there are no forms for absence. The reporter writes a column, and receives a voice that says you are giving them weight. The archivist logs a wet print and feels the room tilt. They are a chain and they know they are missing a link. People tried to sort certainty from ash. Facts on one side, speculation on another. Folklore locked in a display case for visitors. The piles slid on the table and traded pieces when no one looked. If an enemy cell did it, why was the hospital cold? If the party purged them, why did the rifles reappear in new hands before noon? If the women fled to Aragon, why does the contact sheet hang, with 3 frames blacked out and 1 left to accuse? If it was only negligence, why were the faces cut away with the patience of a person who had time and a reason? The papers called it negligence, and the word made the city feel almost normal for a day. The locals whispered something darker, and the word felt like the truth when the light went out. Layered contradictions did the rest. Each version stood up straight until it had to fit through a doorway that was too narrow. Each witness told what they had seen until the scene reached out and touched another, and then both flinched. The result is a shape that sits in the room and refuses to be named. Truth exists. It keeps a lock, and every time someone brings a key, it changes the teeth. There is a plaque that refuses to tell the whole truth. Bronze set in municipal stone. Names of the fallen lined like soldiers who finally stand still. Then an odd rhythm, a longer breath between 2 names. Then another, then a third. 3 gaps smoothed by fingers that come to read and end up rubbing nothing at all. The metal there is duller, warmer. Human oil has made a negative where name should be. A city can learn to speak by omission. It can learn it so well that the tongue forgets the lost syllables. Across town a school wall keeps being painted and keeps being left unfinished in the same place. A mural of volunteers, men with rifles and women with bandages and a sky that tries to look brave. 3 silhouettes stand at the edge of the crowd, unpainted. Year after year the buckets come out and the ladders go up, and someone says leave those for last, and the weather arrives first. Children trace the shapes with chalk. The rain erases without asking permission. The outline grows deeper because nothing covers it. In the suitcase archive that journalists like to whisper about, an old proof sheet lies under glass and hums like a kept secret. Pressure marks outline frames that are no longer attached. A ghost order. In the margin someone once wrote a set of numbers and then rubbed them until the paper thinned. That thin spot lets the light through. In photographs, that is often where the truth gets in. The archivist who logged the find made a choice that cost her sleep. Misfile or expose. She misfiled for 2 weeks. Put the folder in the wrong box with the right hands on purpose. She said later, she kept seeing 3 shallow grooves where a string had once been tied around a stack and cut free. She said she felt air move when the drawer closed. She said decision becomes a structure, and then you live inside it. After 2 weeks she moved the folder back and wrote a note only she could understand. The note has no verbs. It still says everything. A veteran went quiet at a family table where he had never been quiet. A child asked who the women were in the picture with no faces, and he poured wine into a glass he did not lift. That night he pulled the double print from his album and tore the border where the scissors had been tined. He buried the pieces in the drawer under napkins that smelled of lavender. For 3 years he stopped taking the tram that ran along the port. He walked the long route instead, and told no one why his shoes wore out faster in winter. Sometimes the absence is the loudest testimony a man can offer. The nurse who wrote the slashes in the ledger burned her apron in the stove on a morning that was not cold. She fed it slow. She refused to open the window. She said the smell was not smoke. She lived alone by then. Later her grocery lists grew small marks that were not food. 3 short lines gathered in the corners of the paper. When she bought bread she brought home 2 loaves, and an heir that followed her in, and sat at the table uninvited. She stopped talking in rooms where tiles clicked underfoot. The body stores knowledge in the bones, and will never file it properly. The port remembers in its own language. Fishermen swear the water near the old bollards is colder even in heat that shimmers the streets. Lines pulled through that slice of sea come up with a weight that does not belong to the catch. At night watchmen refuse to sit with their backs to a shuttered door because a draft slides under it without wind. Dogs turn their faces from that corner and begin to growl at empty air that seems to have learned to breathe against the grain. Stories do not vanish. They change their clothes. Women from the Barrio Maria Cristina tie red kerchiefs to a rope down by the customs gate on a certain October night because their grandmothers did, and because it keeps the hands steady. No prayers, just fabric. It is a kind of inventory only the river can read. In a handful of houses a coin with a bite along its edge passes from palm to palm when the lights flicker. No one says where the bite began. The coin warms quickly. It always does. People rub it thin rather than let it rest. Evidence repeats itself like a hymn that remembers only the refrain. A missing page and then another. A face erased and then another. A word crossed out so hard the paper gives way and lets you see what lies beneath, which is usually nothing and sometimes more. Numbers recur in places that have sworn not to know each other. Ration cards stamped 3 times in 3 inks. A memo that uses the same shorthand as an unrelated police blotter. Violet withdrawn leaning the same way in 2 offices that would not share stamp pads for anything else. Patterns are their own confession. People pretend not to hear them because patterns do not shut up once acknowledged. A professor in the transition years set out to map the gaps. He placed pins for every absent discharge in the St. Paul ledgers. He set another color for every convoy line that did not match a manifest. He laid a third for every contact sheet, with ink the color of storm over the eyes. His map looked like a disease that knew the city from the river outward. He told his students absence makes a shape, and the shape points in a single direction. He did not say what was at the end, because he did not go. The door inside the map is still closed. The newspapers aged into a single pile at the hemeroteca, where the pages break at the touch. The columns that mattered were small, 2-finger widths wide, words like negligence and reassignment, sometimes in the same line. A day later, a photograph of a typewriter and a woman smiling with a caption about glorious rearguard service. The reach of a camera stops at walls. The sound of boots on tile does not. The respectable surface polished itself and found a reflection it could live with. The rest of the city wrapped its mirrors in cloth. Ruins remain in habits more than in stone. Streets were renamed, and the old names did not leave mouths that had earned them the hard way. Men learned which corners to avoid when the mist lifted from the sea and moved inland. Women learned to keep 3 spare spoons when you cook a pot that is meant for 2, because hunger arrives with guests that do not knock. Doors were tested against small hands and small knocks, and no one could agree what opened them. The past kept coming by the back stairs. It liked the smell of kitchens. At the art school, a printmaking class once tried to restore a damaged contact sheet for a demonstration. The professor mixed the chemicals and the room tilted. Students swore the 3 white ovals glowed more than the black around them. One boy said he saw eyelashes for a heartbeat. The professor turned the tray and the glow went flat. The print hung on the line and dripped, and no one wrote their name on the back. Restoration learned the same lesson as erasure. You can make a surface obey. You cannot make it forget who told it to. People made choices that seemed small and turned out to be weather. A clerk decided that the stamp should come down dry. A foreman decided to draw a line through his own name for no reason he could admit in daylight. A lieutenant decided to write unaccounted, when missing would have been easier to defend. A reporter decided 1 column would be enough to stir the dreamers, and was surprised when the phone rang from a number that could not be traced, because even numbers have learned to lie. Choice is the last instrument history keeps sharp. All of it accumulates. In the air above the harbor, in the glass under lights too white to be kind, in family rooms where frames turn to the wall when guests arrive. The 3 who were named only as numbers live at the edge of proofs that cannot quite bring themselves to become proof. They occupy the bright space in the center of a photograph that remains the eye of the storm. When city workers polish the plaque, they work the empty places with the same care as the names, because it feels wrong not to. No one is paid for that. Everyone knows why they do it, and so the legacy stands on legs that do not stop moving. Museums speak softly in their labels. Guides lower their voices near the port. The mural remains unfinished on purpose, and then by habit, and finally because nothing else looks right anymore. The story chooses new mouths and tests them. If they crack, it moves on. It is patient. It has no weight to tire it out. You are not outside this. You are in the reading room, and your breath fogs the plastic sleeve, and the page inside blurs and sharpens, as if deciding whether to let you through. Your hands hesitate over the index slips. You think you hear the soft thud of boots somewhere down the corridor, where the lights flicker, and then recover. You could choose to close the drawer. You could choose to open the wrong one. Both are decisions. Both leave marks. Perhaps you will find the missing names. If you dare open the archives yourself, the room goes dim and the documents cool, yet your fingerprints stay on the plastic sleeve, as if the past had borrowed your heat. The print with the bright blanks has stopped dripping, but it has not stopped speaking. The ledger does not name them, yet the empty lines are louder than ink. Barcelona holds its breath and the gaps hold you. There is no verdict, only a set of doors you must choose between. An enemy lift under blackout, an internal purge that needed tidy paperwork and used none. A planned escape with help from hands that knew the seam in the city. Each path has a weight, and each weight leaves a mark somewhere in the record. You have walked with us through the marks. What theory fits the evidence best, and which single detail forces your hand? Set it down in the comments and make your case. If this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell to keep the archive open each week. Like this, if the unfinished mural and the 3 empty spaces at the plaque found you in the dark. Tell us what city and state you are listening from so we know how far the tide has carried these names. Share this with the one friend who keeps a box of old photographs face down. Let them choose a door too. Every answer adds weight to a side of the scale that history pretends not to see. We are not done. Next time we walk the length of a hospital train that reached Barcelona with carriages no one could unlock, an account that never matched the living. The manifest swears it is complete. The night says otherwise. Stay close.